Alright, so in this video, I want to show how to create a feature that I'm going to call a door. And essentially, it's just going to be a way from going from one level to the next, or one scene to the next. And if you think of a game like Super Mario World, they had doors. You can see here's the door. The player would walk up to the door and hit up on the D-pad, and it would take you to a new part of the level, kind of like so. So that's the sort of essential functionality we're looking for here. Alright, so first of all, I think we're going to need like a visual representation of our door. So what I will do is go into my sprites. I'm going to grab a square. I'll drag it into the scene. I'm going to scale it a bit to make it look more like a door shape. I'm going to change it to be red. So I just clicked the color of the sprite renderer here. I'm going to make it red just to stand out. I guess my spike is red also, but you know, one day I'll get some real art here. Alright, so here's my door. I'm going to make sure I rename it so that it isn't just called square in the hierarchy. I want to make sure I remember what this thing is, so I'm going to call it door. Maybe one day I would want to add to this name where the door leads so that when you're looking at the level it's clear to figure out what's what. Alright, now I'm going to go into my scripts folder and I'm going to right click and create a new script and I'm going to call it door. I will make one script to describe the behavior of this particular door object. Before I forget, let's go ahead and drag our door script onto our door object here. I'll click on it in the scene view and just confirm that this script actually did go onto the door game object. Then I can just double click here to open the script in Visual Studio. And now we get to figure out what we need to add in order to make the door functionality work. Well, what I am going to show you first is not what we're going to end up doing ultimately, but it's worth seeing. First, let's look at a function called, well, let's talk about what we want to have happen. So basically, I need some sort of hit detection so that when the player is standing in front of the door, I know about it. And then, while the player is in front of the door, I want to check if they press a particular button. We'll say up or whatever button you want. And when you press up, it will activate the door and take you to wherever the door leads. So I don't want the player to be able to stand on top of the door, so I know I'm going to need a box collider 2D, and you can see by default, you know, if I were to run the game, I would just be standing on top of the door like this. That is more of a wall than a door. I can't walk past it. The door is meant to be like in the background. So you can see in this image, Mario can definitely walk in front of the door. So that's not the right kind of door that I have set up. So I'm going to click on my door, and I don't want it to be a regular collider. I need it to be a trigger. And so remember, triggers just don't block the player, but they still detect when things, they don't block anything. They just detect when things enter their trigger area. And the function in code that I want you to be aware of is called onTriggerStay 2D. You got to make sure you always use the 2D versions of all this stuff. Otherwise, things won't work because this is a 2D project. So you just have to remember if it's 2D, make sure you use the 2D version of all of these mono behavior functions. And so onTriggerStay, what that does is it's almost like an update function that gets called every frame as long as something is staying inside of the trigger. And that's more or less what we want. We want to test if the player is staying in the door trigger, and if so, we want to test if the player presses the activate button. So what I'll do is I will say if collision, which is just this argument here, which is getting passed in, and that will be whatever is touching the trigger. So we want to see if that thing is the player. So we'll say if collision.compareTag And gotta make sure you spell player just like it's spelled in the editor in the tags setup. So we can just verify that player character tag player. So you need to spell it just like that and make sure your player character is actually tagged as the player. And so if something is staying inside of my trigger, my door's trigger, and it has the player tag, I am going to do something. For now, what we can do, well, actually, so we could put a log in here and just say player activated door, just to test. But technically, this is going to print like over and over as long as the player's standing in the trigger area. Let's just test that. So we'll save the door script, go back to the Unity editor and run the game. And what I would expect is once I get in front of the door, it starts spitting out repeatedly in the console that I'm activating the door. And you can see it's doing it. So again, it's essentially just like an update. On trigger stay is like getting called as fast as update as long as I'm staying in the trigger. I'm just going to clear the console and leave. And you can see now it's stopped printing. If I walk back in, it will continue printing. So anyhow, it's properly detecting that I'm staying in the trigger area. But the next step is testing if I press some button while I'm staying in that area. So if that's just a Visual Studio shortcut again there. If you type if and then hit tab twice, it will sort of insert what they call a code snippet, which is just like the basic format of an if statement. It's kind of a nice little shortcut. I just have to replace this true with whatever condition I actually care about. And the condition I want to test is if the player is pressing a button. So we'll say input.get button down. Remember down, get button down is only going to return true the frame the user presses the button. Alright, what's the button that I want? I'm going to make a new one called activate. So I'll show you what that means here in a second. I need to close the parentheses on my if statement here. So if the player presses this activate button, then I'm just going to move this line up inside of my if statement. So I'll hold Alt and I'll hit up arrow and then I'll hit Tab to get the indents correct. And I'll delete this empty space and save it. And so now if the player presses this activate button, it should print the message so long as the player is standing inside of the door's trigger area. Let's go back to Unity and define whatever the heck activate is. So I'll need to go to Edit, Project Settings, Input. This will bring up what's known as the Input Manager. And it has all of these axes. You may have to expand it to see them all. These have all been pre-built in by Unity. I'm going to have to add a new one. So I'm going to change the size to 19. And it just, you can see it just duplicated whatever the last one was. So I have two cancels now. It's okay to have multiple entries with the same name. That just lets you define multiple buttons that can represent the same action. So it's a good way to set up, gamepad as well as mouse and keyboard support. Anyhow, I'm going to name this new axis I created, I'm going to call it activate, because that's what I called it in code. Just be very certain that you, whatever you type in here, I'm just going to hit Control C and go back to my code and hit Control V just to be absolutely positive I've not have any kind of typo here. Alright, so what is going to count as the activate button? I can define whatever I want in the positive button here, in the alt positive button, and that's what will count as activate. So I want it to probably be, we'll say I wanted it to work like Mario, so it would be up the up arrow, as well as I'm going to make it for WASD support, that would be W, right? Now, if you wanted, you could go to the axes here again and make it even bigger, like 20, and you'll see that duplicated the last one, which in this case is activate. And now if I wanted, I could put a gamepad option here, or if I wanted the E button to count, like some people are used to hitting E as the activate button on a PC game. So I'll just go ahead and leave E here, just so now it's the player can hit up, W, E, and then I still have room to put in a gamepad button if I knew what I wanted, but I don't, and I don't feel like looking it up. You could look that up if you wanted. I don't even have a gamepad plugged in, so no big deal. So in theory now, if the player presses this activate button that we've defined in the input manager, remember you get to that with edit, project settings, input. So if the player presses that button, it should print out my message so long as they're actually standing in the door's trigger. Alright, so let's just make sure everything's saved, and I will run the game. My log clears because I have clear on play selected. Now it's no longer spitting out the message every frame just for being in here. I want it to, I hope that it does it whenever I press the button. So let's see, up arrow, it did it twice, interestingly enough. The E button, it did it twice, interestingly enough. So this is seemingly a bit of a bug. We'll have to look into what's going on with this bug. But it's at least the timing seems correct, right? When I press the activate button, it is printing the message. It's just doing it twice. So we'll talk about why. I want to clarify if it's not working for you, if it's not printing anything. If you click outside of the game window here, like if you click on another Windows, if I click on Chrome and then go back here, you have to click back in the game window. So you can just make sure you can move around. If you can move around, then it should work. But if you click out of Unity and then you try to move your character, you'll notice it's not picking up that input until again you click in the game window. And so here I am again. So just be on the lookout for that if things aren't working for you. Alright, so I'll stop the game. This would work fine, except it's doing it twice. Why is it doing it twice? It's kind of a weird situation. If you recall how we set up our player, the player, it actually has two colliders on it, right? It has this box collider, which we were just using for collision with the world. So if I were to uncheck this one, you'll notice the player is just going to fall through the world as soon as the game starts. See? Alright, so that's what this box collider 2D was doing, is just our world collision. Then it also has the circle collider. Let's find that. Here's the circle collider 2D. This one is a trigger. This is the one we were using to test for ground beneath the player. So we're testing in this little area beneath the player to see if there's any ground. And if there is, we're going to know that we're on ground and we can jump. And if there isn't, we're not on the ground and we can't jump. So there's two colliders on my player character. If I uncheck the circle, you'll notice you can't jump. So we need both of them. And the reason that our door is printing twice is because the player has two colliders on them. So this is getting called once for each collider 2D that's tagged player that's inside of my trigger region. So since there are two, that is why it's actually getting called twice whenever I activate the door here. It may not actually cause you problems, but it may also, and I don't want to leave that kind of a bug in my game. So let's talk about how to fix it. There are a couple ways. Like one thing I could do is on the player. Where is the player? So on my player, I could get rid of this circle collider 2D and make a child game object. So I could right click on the player and hit create empty to create this child game object of the player. And I could add the collider on this. It would be a circle collider 2D or whatever. And I would have to move it in position just the way I wanted. And then I would have to, in my player character script, somewhere I have a spot for the ground detect trigger. I could then drag this guy into that, and then I'd probably rename this like ground detect object or something like that. And I just observe that this sub object, it is not tagged player. So now all of a sudden this trigger, it wouldn't be activating this condition inside of my on trigger stay. So that's one way to fix it. I'm actually not going to do that. I don't, this is kind of a complicated setup and I just don't want to undo or redo any of it. So I'm going to delete that empty game object. I just have my original player character just how it was from previous tutorials. And instead, I'm going to fix this problem in code. So I told you when we first started that we weren't going to wind up using on trigger stay just because of this problem that it's actually activating twice. So we'll just use a couple other functions instead, and that way you'll have some experience with those functions too. So instead, what I'm going to do is use on trigger enter 2D and also on trigger exit 2D. And this, so what I'll do, let's copy this on trigger stay, not copy rather, but select it. And there's a little button here in Visual Studio. It says comment out the selected lines. I'm just going to hit that. And so now all of these are ignored. I'm going to add a little note to this just so I remember why I'm not doing it. And I'm going to say can't use this because it triggers the door twice. Because the player has two colliders. Alright. So that's just a note for us to remember why we couldn't do this. If you don't need that note, you can delete it. But anyhow, now you know about this button if you didn't previously. Alright, so now what I'm going to do, I have an on trigger enter and an on trigger exit 2D. I want to make a bool to keep track of whether the player's in the trigger or not. So let's make a private bool, and you don't have to type private here, but I'm going to just to be very explicit. It's just a extra element to keep my code clear. So private bool. My bools I want to name as yes or no questions. So this will be is player in trigger. And I can, by default, this will start as false, and that's fine. And then so when the player enters the trigger here, so that would be if collision dot compare tag player close parenthesis. So if the player enters this trigger, I'm going to set is player in trigger equal to true. And likewise, if the player exits the trigger, so I just selected that text and pasted it right in here. If the player exits the trigger, is player in trigger is going to be equal to false. And I will save, but I guess this doesn't, so the next thing I'll do here, this actually, so I can tell if the player's in the trigger, but there's still this part. Where am I going to test if the player's pressing the button? I don't want to put it on trigger enter because then it would only test the very moment the player entered the trigger, so that's no good, and plus it would still give us the double activation issue. So instead I'm just going to get my update back, so I'll start typing update and I'll just hit enter, and Visual Studio filled out the template for our update function. Remember, this gets called every frame, so every frame I'm going to say if, and I hit tab twice to get this code snippet in for me. So if input.get button down, and the name of my input was activate. Again, make sure you spell it exactly like you spelled it in the input manager in Unity. So if the activate button is pressed and the player's in the trigger, so is player in trigger. Now you could say is player in trigger equals true, but you don't need to. You can just say, is the player in the trigger? This thing is either going to equal true or false. And so we can just say it would, all of these conditions boil down to true or false. So this would be true and true. So if true and true, we'll do all this stuff. So just remember, these get reduced down to either true or false. So if the player presses the button and is player in trigger, then we will do the next thing here, which for now is just going to be to print the message for testing. So I'll copy that from my comment and paste it back in here and save my game. Let's Alt-Tab and go back to Unity and try it out. So I'll let it compile, click the play button, walk in the door, and now when I press it, it only goes up by 1 each time. So that did fix my double activation bug. Cool. All right, so we don't just want to print this message. We actually want to do something. Well, we want to basically load a new scene. That's how we're going to treat doors for now, at least. So if you remember, we kind of did this a little bit earlier. In order to load a scene, you use something called the scene manager. So you can start typing scene manager. You'll notice it's not recognized. It could be because you didn't type it right, but it's also, even if you type it perfectly, you're missing a using statement. So I'm going to hit Control period after I've typed scene manager and add this using Unity Engine.scene management. Control period is the hotkey for quick fixes. It's very useful in a lot of contexts, but in this case, it's good for adding missing using statements. So if I select that, you can see what it did is it just added Unity Engine.scene management to the top of my class here. So now it recognizes scene manager. And what do I want to do with scene manager? Well, I want to say scene manager dot load scene. All right, and then like what scene do I want to load? Well, that's a good question. I could hard code it to load some scene. Like, first of all, let's just get another scene that could possibly be loaded. So let's go back to Unity, and I have this sample scene. Nowadays, Unity just gives you a sample scene when you make a new project. That's cool. I'm going to save the sample scene, but then I'm going to go to File, Save As, Save Scene As, that is, and I'm going to go into my Scenes folder because I want all my scenes to be in the Scenes folder, and I'm going to just call this Scene 2. That's a lame name, but this is just a demonstration. So, you could call this jungle or desert or wherever the heck your next area is. I will save scene 2, and for now it's just an exact copy of my old level because I just saved my old level as a new name, scene 2. But now I have two scenes. I have sample scene and scene 2. So for sake of example, let's say that let's double click sample scene, so we're in the sample scene again, that we want this door to load scene 2. So back in code, we could just type that in, scene 2, that's fine. again, make sure you've spelled it exactly the same. I actually think I have a little bit of an error. This is scene 2 with no space, so I need to make sure I type that in just perfectly. Scene 2 with no space. All right, that works. So now when the player presses the button, if they're in the door trigger, it should load scene 2. We can test that out. A couple things we should do. So first of all, let's head into scene 2 and just kind of like move it a little bit so that it's obvious that scene 2 is scene 2 and sample scene is different looking. So I'll just move the box like so it starts right on top of the spike and falls down. I'll take this checkpoint and I'll move it like over here, and so now it's just going to be very apparent. I'll move this checkpoint like right there. That's good. So it's very apparent that there's a difference between scene 1 and scene 2. All right, so I'm going to save scene 2. Again, you can tell we have unsaved changes with this asterisk right next to the name scene 2. I'll hit Control S. That'll save scene 2. I want to go back to sample scene. So now you can see a little bit of a difference between sample scene and scene 2. So let's go into sample scene. You know what? Also, let's go to scene 2 and let's delete the door. That will very much make it evident you're not in the same spot. I'll save that again. Go back to sample scene, which has the door, run the game, and let's see if going in here loads scene 2. It's actually, oh, well, here's an interesting problem. Let's fix this first. The player's going behind the door. I want the player to go in front of the door. Let's fix that real quick. So if you select the door and you look at its sprite renderer, a couple of things we can do. We can either change its order in the layer or we can change its sorting layer. So right now everything is on the sorting layer called default because that's the only one I have. So you look at the player is also on this default layer. And then you can look at order in layers. So if I change the order in the layer and I make this like higher, like let's make it -1. And now let's see what happens if I walk in front of it with my player. Now the player is in front of it. So you can see the earlier numbers are farther back. So the player is on 0. Where's my player? There it is. He's on 0 order in layer. So that's one way to fix it. Another thing you might want to do is actually click on the sorting layer drop down and add a new sorting layer. So I have default. I could make something called maybe background and then drag it so that it is actually behind default. So I can go to my door, I can put it back on 0, but let's actually put it in the background sorting layer, and that should also give me the same situation where it's drawing behind my player. This will be useful if I have a lot of background objects. The sorting layer thing is nice. You may also want to create a foreground sorting layer. You could do that the same way in your sprite renderer here. Sorting layer, add sorting layer. You could make a foreground sorting layer, which I will do, but I'm not actually going to use. Oops. Foreground. So this would be in front of default. So the player will be on default. Stuff like maybe there's like little grass or stuff I want in front of the player. That'll go in the foreground, and then things in the background like this door will go in the background. Alright, anyway, that's sorting layers. Let's go test our door again now. There's going to be a new problem, so let's get ready to fix that. So if I press the button to activate it, it says Scene 2 couldn't be loaded because it has not been added to the build settings. So what this means is you have to go to Edit, Project Settings, Player. Is that what I'm looking for? No, that's not right. Let's see. File, Build Settings. That's where it is. Sorry. So File, Build Settings. This is how we get to the build settings. And you can see anything that you want to be in your game, in the game's build, which is just like the published version of the game, needs to be in this list scenes in build. And you can see sample scenes in there, but scene 2 is not. So the way to fix it is to go to your project window here and just make sure you drag all the scenes you want in there. Sample scene's already there, so that's fine. Let's drag scene 2 in. And there we go. So now they're both in there. Let's close that and try again. We'll walk up to the door and I hit the activate button and you can see now I'm in scene 2. You can even see in the hierarchy here it says scene 2. So I'm definitely in scene 2, but if I stop the game, I'm back in sample scene where I started. So my door is actually leading me to a new scene. That's cool, but I want to add a little bit more functionality to it. I don't like the fact that no matter what, my door is always going to take me to scene 2. I can imagine a world where there are many doors that lead to many different places, so this is kind of a crappy setup. So let's double click on the door. Let's go to the top and actually, rather than hard coding something in here, let's make a variable for it and expose it to the editor. So we want to use serialized field to expose stuff to the editor. This way we can use private variables instead of public because nothing else needs to know about this. So I want it to be private, but I also want it to be exposed to the editor. So that's what serialized field will do. Let's make this, well, we could make it a string. So we'll say string, and we'll call it scene to load. How about that? I don't know what it's going to be by default, so I'll just leave it uninitialized. And then rather than loading scene 2 every time, let's delete that and pass into load scene the variable scene to load. So that's pretty cool. If I save this and go to the editor now, you can see in the door script, if you click over here and let it compile, there's a spot to enter whatever scene you want to load. So we'll still try and load scene 2 just because that's the only scene I have. We'll hit play. We'll go over here and it's still working. Let's go to scene 2 and put a door to scene 1 in there. So we'll go to scenes. Better save this one before we leave. And then we'll load scene 2 here. And let's add a door. Actually, it's probably a good idea to make the door a prefab, since I can imagine having multiple doors and I don't want to have to change them all at once. Or I don't want to have to change them all individually. I want to change them all at once so they're all consistent and work the same way. So let's go back to this. Find the door game object here. Let's go to our prefabs folder and drag the door in. So there's the door prefab. Now I can make all kinds of doors really easily just by dragging that prefab into the scene. Alright, so let's go back to scene 2. So I'll just double click scene 2. Yeah, I can save, that's fine. And let's go to the prefabs folder and drag a new door in. This door will be on this side so we can tell that it's different. What scene is this one going to load? This one is going to load sample scene. I can't remember how they spell that. There's no space. Okay, cool. So you can kind of see an issue here, like where if I were to type this in wrong, it won't work right, and that's kind of bad. Maybe there's a way we can look into fixing that, but for now, let's just save it. I'll run this. Let's go to that door and see if it takes me to scene 1. And here we are in scene 1, and it takes me to scene 2. Cool. So that's our door in a nutshell. We could add a lot more to this. We could, remember Mario had the nice fading in and fading out. That would be cool. We could add sound effects. That would be cool. But this is the core functionality.